Hi there and welcome to the December edition of Cinetopia, and it's hard to believe a whole year's gone by since January, but there they are, it's almost Christmas. I won't say ho ho ho, oh blast, I just did. Sorry about that. And we'll be looking back at the last year in film and beyond and picking some of our favourite films of the last decade. So I hope you're looking forward to the festive season and the holidays, and we'll be finding out what the others have been doing. Jim, how's your what have you been up to lately, and how's your year been?
So I was in America for Thanksgiving. My wife is American, so we were spending it with some of her family, so I've eaten quite a lot of turkey even ahead of Christmas. Whether that's a good idea for my diet, I don't know, but very enjoyable all the same. While I was there, managed to see a few films that are not out in the UK for a while, some of which we will review on the show early next year. Things like Lighthouse, Parasite, and also a couple of some of the films that we're going to review on the show today. Jojo Rabbit, which Amanda and I have both seen. We'll be talking about that. So basically I loaded up on films.
Sounds great. So lucky you, and I hope that was pleasant Thanksgiving. And Luka, so what have you been up to?
Dreading the start of the new decade when AI takes over and Brexit still doesn't happen. But no, I've been on the freelance photo circuit, and I'm just sort of finishing Cinetopia's blog about our favourite films of the year.
Favourite films of the year, we're looking forward to that.
Whereas we will be discussing our favourite sort of films of the last decade in this podcast.
Great, thanks. Amanda, you're looking radiant and tanned from an overseas trip, I presume.
Yeah, to sunny Florida, and I got to spend a little bit of time in the sun finally. So yeah, it was very good. And like Jim, I had a lot of turkey and a lot of turkey leftovers and all that good stuff. And then I quickly came back to Nottingham and attended the This Way Up festival, which is a festival for film exhibitors across the UK. I'm on the development forum this year of it, and it was really, really fascinating. I think we're going to talk a little bit about just a couple things about lists and canon and whatnot. There was a lot of talk about resilience and resilience and sustainability in a world of cinema exhibition, which right now is being disrupted by many things, as you know, and also just this idea of which I'm quite passionate about, more than just a cinema. How can a cinema space be something? How can you take it out of the cinema space? How can you bring cinema events? And that's one of the things I feel like Cinetopia tries to do at this stage. But in the future, it gave me a lot of thoughts about this idea of a hub and how a cinema can be so much more for filmmakers and also up and coming filmmakers and whatnot. So I was really, really inspired, and then came back here, and here I am.
Well, welcome back. It's nice to have you along. Great. Well, thanks for sharing that with us, Amanda, and we'll look forward to hearing more about the hub idea and future plans, I dare say, in coming episodes. So, 2019, we've had it's fair to say, an extremely busy year at the Edinburgh Short Film Festival, which concluded on the 10th of November at the CA, and it was a great experience. We had a ball, really busy, and very much looking forward to planning next year, which will be the 10th anniversary. So that was fun. Just pretty much recovering from that really last few weeks. It was quite exhausting, but I think I've put on a bit of weight, so that's good. So yeah, we'll see what the rest of them have been up to. We'll start with Jim, your year. How do you think it's gone?
Pretty well. A lot of good cinema, a lot of bad cinema, a lot of in-between cinema, a lot of cinema. So I did a few things I've enjoyed doing this year. First of all, the show, actually. This marks the 12th show since you guys relaunched it, and I've had enormous fun doing that, in particular because I can just waffle on at length and not actually have to write something and spell check it and grammar check it and everything. I can just discuss away. I think one thing that stood out for me this year, and it's kind of relevant in the films that we're going to be reviewing the show, is actually the way that this the streaming versus theatrical distribution debate is kicked up. We spoke about, on the very first show I did with you all, we spoke about it in the context of Roma and some Oscars predictions. It's really gone up a notch this past year, and I think in the coming months it's really going to come home with Marriage Story, which we're reviewing on the show, The Irishman, which we're reviewing on the show. They are Netflix releases. They're going to be awards contenders. I think there's going to be so much more discussion around this, and this debate is nowhere near reached its peak. I think it's basically starting, and you're going to see a lot of we've seen the start of them. There's going to be a lot of fundamental shifts in the way films are viewed, consumed, and distributed. So it maybe seems odd to say it as a highlight, but I think there's a lot of really interesting discussions that come out of it, and I think there's a lot of films this year that have shown that. Beyond that, I've been to many film festivals: Edinburgh Short Film Festival, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Cambridge. Seen some wonderful cinema. I actually think it's been a really good year for film, and I think you can tell that from. So Luka will be putting up a blog post on the best our kind of favourite films of the year, and I think with the range of films people have chosen there, you see, I think it's been a very, very good year. A lot of notable stuff has happened. We've got a new highest grossing film of all time, of course, for whatever you think of it or whether you like it or not. There's a new one, so it's been a very eventful year for film, and I think it's been quite a good one, really.
Yeah, great. So, Luka,
yeah,
how's your year been?
I would agree. Well, it's been a roller coaster, Paul. I'll be honest with you. But I would agree as well.
Thrilling.
It's like this is I think my 4th or 5th time doing the show, but like I really enjoyed it. And rest assured to the audience, the argument over Joker between me and Jim still goes on.
Is that not finished yet? It's still going on?
Oh, yes.
No, as far as I'm concerned, it's done. But Luka keeps poking the bear.
Well, somebody's got to quit,
Yeah. Well, it did make $1 billion. I'm just saying. I would say as well, like for me, particularly with Cinetopia as a whole, like the highlight was Cinema on the Shore that we did in April. Mm-hmm. As far as like our events goes, that was really sort of a watermark for us.
You can say watermark,
yeah,
unironically.
Jesus Christ! Look, but like, I'm glad it rained because it taught us that problem solving, like we got through in the end.
Absolutely,
and it was there, and there was a great turnout and a good response as well. And also, it was great, but I did cry again at Cinema Paradiso.
Right, okay.
Luckily, I was in a corner by myself, so I could have that time to me.
Yeah. I thought you were just trying to keep your pizza dry.
Yeah. No, it was the rain that was on my face. It was it's been a roller coaster of a year, but I felt alive even in the worst parts of it.
Wow. That's great. It's nice to feel alive, isn't it? And Amanda, your year, how do you think, and what's the verdict?
Yeah, I think I learned a lot. It was quite an intense year. I don't even think we expected to do as many. And it was really nice that you mentioned that, Luka. I think Cinema on the Shore was one of our highlights. It was incredibly, and one of our best problem-solving moments, and one of the times when I was probably the most tired I've ever been in my life afterwards. But we started these networking events, and we started to get to meet people within this film community and to see how vast it is. And we created a masterclass, which talked about post-production with Ali Murray and Stephen Horn and Naomi Aspiro. We worked with so many different people. We created this podcast, and I think on EHFM and worked with them. I think it's really exciting. And then we did the Scalarama craziness, which we ran 5 or 6 events all in like 1 month, and worked with Andy Dannett and Serena Scateni and all these other independent exhibitors. And then, of course, the Edinburgh Short Film Festival, which is always a highlight for me. So I'm sort of impressed that I went to so much film events. I ran so many film events, and I might run a few less next year, but we were ambitious and we did it, so it was very exciting.
Yeah, it was extremely busy, as you say, and quite hard to remember them all. I guess there's so many.
And we have one coming up on Friday, if this goes out before then, Elf on Lee Theatre. So another thing, like Lee Theatre has been an incredible, we did this Rocky Horror Picture Show with the shadow cast, and people were incredibly involved in that. And I'm not the biggest Rocky Horror Picture Show fan, but I think that was one of my favorite screenings because of how engaged everyone was in the cinematic process. So very, 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 very exciting.
Excellent. Yes, that sounds like fun. If they brought the rice, and etc.
Rice Krispies, we made it. So
yeah. Great. what's coming up in 2020 in January. We've got quite a few events, I think, lined up. First of all, I'd like to mention that Edinburgh Shorts are teaming up with Shortcuts Amsterdam, who have an international audience award programme which screens the best Dutch films, best Dutch short films, to audiences basically pretty much internationally, and they've got partners including the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences and the South Africa Film Festival and so on. So we'll be getting involved in that and screening at the Film House on Wednesday, January the 15th, the best Dutch shorts of the year. Nominee panel includes Rutger Hauer, although I don't think he's coming, but he's very welcome. And you are too, so if you want to see that, come along Wednesday, January 15th. Amanda, what's happening with you in January?
Well, so we just started a couple months ago these family-friendly, we call them Sunday matinees at Lee Theatre, and they're intergenerational screenings of classic cinema. We just did White Christmas, and before that, Singing in the Rain. So Wizard of Oz is coming up in the beginning of January. The date escapes me at this moment, but then we'll be collaborating with the wonderful Lethal 8 organization, which is they do various amounts of artwork and art creative projects and creative production across Leith have been around for quite some time. Sing Along Sunshine and Leith at Leith Theatre, so that will be quite interesting with bands and other music. So
can anyone sing along? You can get up on stage and sing along.
Yeah, you can, I think.
Sorrow.
Exactly. Yeah. So those are the ones that we're looking forward to early on, and then of course we'll probably have our networking in January.
I think you have your star performer for that here in this very studio. So that sounds very exciting.
Yeah.
Anything else? There's the projection project you'll be working on for Coast and Sea.
Oh yeah. Well, that's so as my other hat, I am working with Hogmanay on a project called Message from the Skies, and there's going to be some really amazing new letters that have been written about Scotland in the year of coast and waters, with people like K.S. Ben-Coley from Young Fathers and Irvin Welsh, and all of those things will be announced on the 1st of January, and it will run across Edinburgh projected on landmarks across Edinburgh from the 1st to the 25th. So check that out. It's been a lot of work, but it's been really, really rewarding. I'm so excited for people to see it. Yeah,
I look forward to seeing that. It sounds fantastic. So, apart from looking back at some of our favourite films of the last decade, we've also got our monthly review slots. So this month we're reviewing The Irishman, Marriage Story and Jojo Rabbit. So we'll be looking at those very shortly.
So first up is the aforementioned Irishman, which is Scorsese's epic masterpiece about painting houses and interior carpentry. But no, it's his second Netflix film of the year after his Bob Dylan documentary Rolling Thunder Review. Based on the book by Charles Brown, I Heard You Paint Houses, about Frank Sheeran, who was involved, initially always with the Buffalino crime family, but then ultimately was the enforcer, house painter of Jimmy Hoffa. And much like Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in America, it takes Robert De Niro as an old man, but now he's actually old, looking back on his life in said enforcement role. So Jim, let's start with you. What do you think?
I think it's brilliant. Really, I went into I'm a big Martin Scorsese fan, particularly the work he's done with Robert De Niro. So, I don't think it's necessarily much of a surprise that I like the film. I'm surprised at how much I liked it. Because going into it, I think the two headline things that you know about this film going into it are it is 3.5 hours long, and they've made use of the kind of the de-aging tech, which is very in vogue now. Those are the things you know going in. So you kind of get this idea that it's, as Paul said, it's kind of like one final hurrah on the way to the graveyard, if you're right. So, because everybody involved, everybody is getting on a bit. I was surprised at how much of his filmography Scorsese blends together here. So the popular notion of Scorsese's films are, the gangster themed ones, or the ones that are kind of crime focused, so The Departed, Goodfellas, Casino, Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, that sort of thing. But he does have that other aspect to his filmmaking, which is a lot more spiritual, a lot more contemplative, and kind of rooted in religious thought, almost. And the most obvious examples of that are probably the film he did before this, Silence, and I think The Last Temptation of Christ is probably the other one that would come to mind for me. And I think he's really done a wonderful job of blending the sort of criminal hijinks of some of his most popular films with the deep soul-based questions that you will find in his other work. Because it's not to say that the morality of like some of the things that these gangster characters do hasn't been questioned in his films before. They have. But this one, it really takes you into the moral rot that sets in. And this idea of people following a code, right? Because all of these mob-based films are, they're very based in ideas of honor and loyalty and all this sort of stuff. But this film really takes to the nth degree the effect that has on someone across decades. In other films, even other films of his, it's dealt with. It absolutely is. But here, it is really it sinks in. And I think that's, for me, part of the reason I did not feel the length.
Well, I would agree. For me, the argument, I mean, I've seen you write about this already. Thelma Schoonmaker's editing here is amazing. But it's not just individual scenes and shots. It is the fact that if you go for the whole 3.5 hour mark, you feel everything building up to that last 30 minutes because of the way the film is structured. It is even though it's the most contemplative, as you said, and melancholic part of the film, the last 30 minutes is a powerhouse based on the brickwork of everything before. I'm sorry, I keep making these housing references, but yeah. Really,
this film is superb, and I think the way it blends those things is fantastic. I think this is... I'm very wary of using the word masterpiece, right? But I would be surprised if I don't think of that this way come the end of the next decade. And far from it just being Scorsese's, it is Thelma Schoonmaker's. It is paced to perfection, it is edited fantastically, and if she put a single foot wrong in this film, you'd start to feel the length, and I really did not.
Paul, what did you think?
Yeah, I'll go pretty much along with what Jim said. It's probably, for me, one of the films of the last decade, perhaps. It was fantastic. I would say there's a few things. I mean, obviously the de-aging technique was quite interesting. I think also they re-aged them as well, so it wasn't just de-aging. They made them much older than they currently are. It worked okay. It didn't really distract from the film. I mean, you didn't really look for it. You didn't really make you feel that you were checking out how good it was. But I think that one of the problems, there's a few things with the film, and one of them is the fact that although they de-aged them at 40, they still move like they're 75. There's a scene where De Niro is kicking somebody's head in, and it looks like he's stepping over a puddle. So there's little elements like, apart from that, I think the whole thing holds up incredibly well. And as you say, the editing is fantastic. There's a lot of very short scenes which are elaborate setups, which are only on screen for 10, 20, 30 seconds. So an incredible amount of detail and work that's gone into that.
I agree about for me, the de-aging didn't work. But everything about the film outside of it was like, it made it forgivable. And it's cool to see Scorsese not being an old fart and experimenting. He had this whole thing where it's like, there'd be like 16 different lenses, 4 different cameras and stuff like that. And that like the ILM tech guys would come in and do like a Eucharist procession. That's the way he described it. And they would go away. It's like, okay, we can shoot a film again. So it's like, even though, he still doesn't get the techniques of it, he is experimenting. And it's great to see like a 76-year-old doing that. And that Netflix is doing that as well. That Netflix is producing that, considering, other studios did turn him down. Despite the cast and the project, yeah.
And for me, the technical, like that part of it, the de-aging, for me, it pretty much works. Like Paul's spot on, and I've written about this. The way, the manner in which it falls down is they still have the body language of men in their late 70s. It's just kind of like that slight hunch, the slight slowness in the movement, and unfortunately, that scene where he's beating up a greengrocer, unfortunately, that's where it stands out the most. For me, it didn't really take away from it, and some of them deal with it better than others. Like, for instance, I actually think Al Pacino deals with it quite well. Particularly some of his scenes as kind of, like 50-ish-year-old Jimmy Hoffa, he does quite well, I think. I think his body language and the way he moves is actually a lot better. There's so many aspects to this film. Like, I mean, it's also a very funny film, actually. Like, I mean, for something that's dealing with like a historical thing, which is actually kind of tragic and is shrouded in mystery and kind of like really quite, in some cases morally repugnant people. There's a lot of humor here.
Well, I would say, like, for me, there was always a spiritual trilogy between or among Goodfellas, Casino, and Wolf of Wall Street. Because there was a progression of criminality to sort of legitimize criminality, whereas like this, whilst it has the style, stands out because of the self-awareness. And the scene that stands out is when Hoffa is screaming at his other enforcers, and De Niro walks out like offended, and then Pacino goes out and he's like, no, like I didn't mean it, like you take off. He starts taking off his coat, like two old men sort of like bickering at each other. So this is definitely for me a film that only a 76-year-old could have made, but like the self-awareness, the comedy was so, and it's not as violent either as those other gangster pictures that he's made,
Which is actually interesting, because then when it does have its violent moments, and it's not gory violence, but it is shocking. I mean, it is shocking violence, and it's more like, it's like, Robert De Niro being some sort of like, grey-haired Terminator or something like that. Like, it's kind of shocking in that regard. I think one other thing that's interesting about the performances, especially given we've just commented about the fact that there is humour in this, like, that kind of like wisecracking that you know of in mob films. It's done very well. But the thing that I find interesting about it is one character that really doesn't engage in it at all and actually probably plays against type is Joe Pesci.
Yeah,
and I think it's a wonderful performance from him, and his performance spans the same ages as De Niro's. Like, we go from when he's, not necessarily a young man, but he's certainly not, he's certainly not old, kind of like pre-middle aged, through to kind of like him being very elderly. And I think the consistency of performance he's got there, and the measured way he approaches that character of is it Russell Buffalino, is really superb, and it's kind of against type, because you think of Joe Pesci as the guy in Goodfellas, I'm funny to you how, and My Cousin Vinny, and even like Home Alone and things like that, and he's done a variety of roles in his career, and not all of them have been in that mode, but I think this is kind of one of the biggest profile ones where he plays against the popular perception of him. I think.
Added to that, much like Scorsese's other films, this is a very talk-heavy film, but for me, it's Joe Pesci's or Anna Paquin's silence that really, kind of carries forth what the film is about, which is euphemisms and the effect of violence and sociopathy on other family members. And
I'm interested to see what you guys think about it, because the other part of the performances which there's been a little bit of discussion about, is Anna Paquin's role as Frank Sheeran's daughter. What did you two make of that? Because I have my thoughts, and I think it was very effective, but I'm interested in what you thought.
Yeah, I thought she was very good. I mean, very little screen time, and I don't think she had more than one or two lines. Beyond that, she's very effective. I mean, it was all in glances and looks to camera, and very, very strong performance. And I think that did bring out, the overall theme of regret and reflection, and that it reminded me actually a little bit towards the end of the film. There's a sequence. I don't want to spoil it, but there's a sequence where he goes to visit his daughter, and she's working in a bank at the time. And it reminded me of the scene in a Johnny Depp film, I think it was Blow, where he's dreaming about his daughter visiting him when he's in prison. And it had that kind of real emotional power about it, a real sadness. So I thought that was extremely effective, and she was absolutely fantastic, I think.
Well, I mean, I think cinema is not just about the spoken word. It is about someone, the way someone looks, not in terms of looks, in terms of the emotion that's registered on the face. And I think, well, it's not just Anna Paquin. It's also like that character is also a little girl, and she's really good. That actress, the little girl that plays her, is just someone that is bottling things up, but still maintaining composure as well, but is clearly affected by it. I think that's the counterpoint, and that's Scorsese's. He understands the visual.
Yeah, and I think there's different categories of performance in the film, and I think Anna Paquin's is the best one that exhibits the what you can do without dialogue. And it really hammers home, for me, a lot of the themes of the film and the journey of, her character as well, but also the role that plays in the central journey of Frank Sheeran. There are other roles in the film that I think exhibit the same sort of thing. We've already spoken about Joe Pesci. I think the amount he does with dialogue-free scenes is very impressive. It's a very small role that Harvey Keitel gets, but he's in the same category. It's more about what is not said and kind of like the way that things come through on his face rather than in his words. And then you've got the more talkative roles, Al Pacino. He has his contemplative moments, but generally I would think he gets a lot of dialogue and a lot of speaking lines, and he does as good a job as you would expect. I think it's the best thing Al Pacino's been in for decades, quite frankly.
Yeah.
It's the best performance I've seen him put in.
Even though it is a very Al Pacino performance.
Well, yeah, but it's the good Al Pacino. It's the good stereotypical Al Pacino performance. Yes, he's very loquacious and he gets very animated at points.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like that. I for one don't really care for Scent of a Woman, right? That to me it kind of goes the other side of the line in terms of the sort of like an Al Pacino performance, copyright, registered, trademark, right? All that, what you expect of it. To me, it feels a little bit more like the slightly more character-driven anger and animation of other roles he's done.
Well, I think the test of that as well is particularly when we get closer to Hoffa's disappearance, if we're going to call it that. He does show when he's still stubborn about his role as union leader and stuff like that. He touches the right points, in terms of emotion and subtlety as well. I think you're right.
Yeah, I think the performances are good. It's made headlines because it's Pesci, De Niro, Pacino, right? And I think it deserves to be noted for bringing them together because more importantly, it's got brilliant performances out of all of them. Because there's other films that De Niro and Pacino have been in together. Like what was it?
Righteous Kill.
Righteous Kill. That was it. It was a load of it was a load of nonsense, right? So, just getting them together doesn't do it. You need to get a good performance from them. This film absolutely does that. It absolutely does it. It's the best thing that Pacino has been in decades. I think it's really the best thing that De Niro has been in quite a long time as well. And for that, I'm grateful because those are kind of like two of my favourite on-screen actors, but they've not made a lot in recent years that I want to see. But this, it's fantastic.
I was kind of trepidatious about the film going in because seeing the trailers, I was worried about the way it looked because I only ever saw it on a laptop, the trailers, and it did look a bit like the washed out color grade of a Netflix film. It did feel a bit televisual, but we saw it on the big screen. And that car going through the car wash is breathtaking. It's a slow. And for me as well, it's on top of the de-aging, I like what Scorsese is doing stylistically with. He started using a lot of slow motion. You saw it in Wolf of Wall Street when they're taking the Quaaludes and stuff like that. But here, there's that scene where there's some sort of, I can't remember. There's a union demonstration. Guy gets shot by Crazy Joe or whatever, and then there's this, this Caravaggio shots of slow motion that he's perfected, and of course the editing helps it. But it's like what De Palma said when he saw Raging Bull. It's like there's always Scorsese just upping the game, and he's still doing it at 76. So.
All right, so first up in our reviews, like we said, we're in a little bit of a Netflix theme this month, is Marriage Story. And it's currently on Netflix, but, premiered in a couple places, I think, around the UK and a couple theaters. It also made its debut in New York at the Paris Theatre, my favorite theatre in New York, which had closed down. And it turns out that Netflix has bought a theatre in New York, which is actually quite funny and also sort of ironic because it's called the Paris Theatre and all of France hates Netflix. But I'm so excited about that in a lot of ways because when I come back to New York, I'll go to my favorite theatre, and I think it's an interesting conversation we can have at another point. But back to Marriage Story, Noah Baumbach wrote and directed this film. It stars Scarlett Johansson, Adam Driver, Laura Dern, Alan Alda, and Ray Liotta. And as one can imagine. It's about the breakup of a marriage with a young son. It starts, where they're sort of deciding the separation to, the divorce and the divorce stage and all of the sort of conversations that go around that and, the pathways that it happens. It's also mostly about bi-coastal, so there's a very New York and LA sort of centric storyline. Of course, as everyone I think knows in this room, I'm a big Noah Baumbach fan, and this film really did everything I needed it to do, particularly in my life stage right now. I really loved it. I thought the acting, of course, I think Scarlett Johansson, Adam Driver are great actors, but I think they did such a wonderful job, and that Stephen Sondheim moment was so nice as well. So I would like to know what you guys think.
Yeah, I mean, I think I pretty much agree. It's got quite a lot going on, actually. I mean, it's called Marriage Story, and it follows a divorce, but there's quite a lot of stuff going on beyond that. Like, there's quite interesting parallels between New York and LA from kind of like an American cultural standpoint, because basically what happens is, so it's kind of semi-autobiographical, right? So one of the main characters, Charlie, who's played by Adam Driver, is basically meant to be kind of a cipher for Noah Baumbach himself. Mm-hmm. And it's really kind of telling the story of his divorce from, is it Jennifer Jason Leigh?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Before he was with Greta Gerwig.
Yeah. I'd love to be a fly on the wall when Greta Gerwig watched this film. But so it follows that story, and basically the Charlie character is a theatre director. So the Scarlett Johansson character is the lead actress in his play. And she's given up kind of like various Hollywood opportunities to continue to do that. But when this separation comes about, she moves to LA to take up opportunities there, and it's kind of a little bit unclear what their future is. And you get this kind of interesting contrast between New York and Los Angeles. So there's that part to it. There is, of course, also the personal story of the two of them. And I think that is rooted very much in the performances. I think it's an excellent pair of performances. I don't think I'm quite as blown away by the film as a whole as, like, certainly I think you seem to be and some other folk are, but it is a real quality piece of work. It's well written. I didn't find it overwrought, which this story really could easily have been. It's got that kind of quirky naturalism that I suppose you'd think of Baumbach for, but it's also very low on whimsy. It's not a... When I say it's got a quirkiness to it, I don't mean it's a quirky film. It's more, it captures that kind of like everyday reverence that you use to get through situations like this, I suppose. So the performance is good, the script is good, and basically it just all comes together really rather well. I think with different performers it maybe wouldn't have landed quite as much, but it has those performances and it all really comes together quite superbly for me.
Yeah, me too. I liked it too. Even though I'm not, again, as people in this room know, I don't particularly... The ones I have seen, not particularly taken by Baumbach, more so by Greta Gerwig's stuff than his. I was kindly surprised by this and how much I liked it. I think, like, some issues aside, which include, like, I think, like, when the film pushes towards humor, like, certain jokes, I think, just fall flat.
Which ones do you think?
I can't remember, but it was like, I just felt... by the time, let me put it this way, by the time Alan Alda got into the film, I was like, okay, here we go. This is the human comedic core. This, like, by the time Alan Alda got into the film, I was like, okay, I am sold on this film completely. And then by the time there's that scene where they're just screaming at each other, where Baumbach just lets them sort of have their Oscar moment, where it's like they're competing performances, if, when, Driver falls apart at the end of it. I thought that was really well done. There's even a shot that does directly invoke Bergman's Scenes from a Marriage.
Sure.
But this one, at times I was like, oh, this isn't Bergman's Scenes from a Marriage, because, it's not this hardline, cynical, cold, doctor's view or counselor's view of marriage. But that's not what this film was really trying to be. It was trying to be, I think, something warm. And the cinematography, this is for me, this is his best looking film. I think, like,
oh no, we'll talk about some.
But in terms of like the 35 mil, but like the choice of cinematography for the subject matter.
Yeah.
No matter how, there's a line in the film that's, I think, even taken directly from Kramer versus Kramer, which is like, divorce lawyers see couples at their worst. I think that's the line.
Mm-hmm.
But this film sees, through the cinematography, this film sees people at their best, despite the fact that they're at their worst, that they are still human beings that are trying to figure this out, no matter how Machiavellian divorce proceedings can get between couples.
Sure.
And yeah, like that sudden musical moment, which like, whether it's Cold War or Shape of Water, it's like whenever someone like goes on stage to express themselves through song or dance, I'm like, yeah, I'm in. And Adam Driver, give him some vocal training. He's a great singer. Like,
Yeah.
You see, the funny thing is, right, just to play devil's advocate, that moment didn't actually really do it for me. Like, I fully accept I'm in the minority.
Thespian, I mean,
oh no,
Sondheim
Christ,
fan.
no,
Oh, see, that's the thing.
I am fully willing to accept that's why. But it's just interesting because like that seems to be, without spoiling it, it's basically a moment towards the end of the film, right, and it kind of seems to bring a nice close to Charlie's arc, if you like, and like where he ends up at the end of the film. But I don't know, it's just something about my makeup. It didn't really do it for me. The rest of it I found much better, which isn't to say I think it's bad, it's more just it didn't have the same impact on me. I think a lot of the chat around this film and the performances will focus on Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver. I think it is worth talking about the supporting performances as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it really adds a lot of colour to the film, and I think it balances the tone that Noah Baumbach is going for quite well. Because obviously there's a lot of humour here. Now, for me, not all of it works 100%. Like, I wasn't fully sold on the wife's family and the mother in particular. I felt like that had kind of been parachuted in from a different film, to be honest with you. It felt like it was a lot more whimsical than some of the other ones. But
now that you remind me, that's the whole pie sequence where she's meant to serve him with the papers, and the sister, there's that whole thing. It was like, why is she carrying a pie? I was like, is this meant to be funny? Okay. Sorry.
What did you say? I didn't know. I mean, I was all right. To be honest, I was all right with that bit. It was more just there was something about the tone of those interactions that just didn't sit right. Because the rest of it, even when it is ramped up to be a little bit caricaturish, it's all quite naturalistic, right? I mean, it all feels pretty genuine. That didn't to me. But that aside, a lot of the supporting performances really give it that tone it needs. In particular, the ones that I'm really thinking of here are Ray Liotta, Alan Alda, and Laura Dern, who play basically the various lawyers that both of them interact with. Because the entire point of this process and separation is, we want to do it without lawyers, and then obviously,
it becomes
it's
about
not a spoiler to say that obviously that completely descends, and that's not the case. But those supporting characters, I think, do a lot to set that tone of balancing this kind of heartbreak and personal anguish with humour, right? Because just because these things happen doesn't mean there aren't things that are funny, things you find humorous, and I think that those supporting characters are what balance that tone quite well. Because Adam Driver and Scarlett Johansson's characters are pretty straight. I mean, like Adam Driver does quite a good job of reacting incredulously to things, right? That it's like he's very underrated in that department. But their characters are overall fairly straight. So the balancing of the tone that I think Baumbach wanted to go for is done very well by those supporting characters, and I wouldn't be surprised to see them get a little bit of recognition as this kind of rumbles on.
Yeah, I think Laura Dern's character for me was my favorite. I'm particularly a huge Laura Dern fan, and I think we were talking about this earlier, that it's almost kind of an evolution of, if you've seen Big Little Lies, like a similar kind of character. Really, really funny. Also, really, like her ability to kind of, I like the one scene when she's talking to Charlie about his work and right, and then jumps right back into firing the good lawyer, the good lawyer that she is.
MacArthur grant.
But yeah, I mean, incredible.
Also, I would have liked to see more of him, but Wallace Shawn on as well. He was part of the New York theater group. It was particularly funny, but it's like a few more scenes would have been really nice with him.
Yeah, no, I think that what you said, Jim, about this New York versus LA thing, I think it's also kind of interesting because I feel like a lot of artists go through that process of deciding, like, and it's been funny because over the years of living in New York, LA was kind of like the evil, like brother or sister to New York. And then I've noticed that a lot of filmmakers, not only because maybe they're moving to LA, but have sort of become kind of interested in moving to LA now that it's perhaps become a little bit more hipster or whatnot. So I loved that kind of setting as kind of part of the themes of deciding as an actor or director or creative, where they place themselves, and also where they place a relationship that takes over your life in a lot of ways, and how you can kind of create, how there can be competition within a relationship when we're dealing with creatives and artists, but there can also be this loss of self and our ability to create through that as well. So I just thought that was so well articulated in this story.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the way it portrays that central relationship is very well done, and it's very interesting, because I've not really seen a lot of films that do that well, in the sense that they balance that idea of, you've got this strong central relationship where there is a single entity that forms out of it, right? But then if that breaks down and people go their separate ways, or even if they become frustrated within that unit, how do you go about finding a way to reforge your own identity? It's like, who you are, but you need to find your way back to it almost. And I think for both of those characters, I think it does that really, really quite well. And I think it does it without favouring... I am of the opinion, I've seen, other opinions are available, trademark, but I don't think it favours one character over the other.
No.
I don't think it's equally balanced at all points in the film. Like, I don't think it's kind of like doing that juggling act throughout. I think it swings from one back to the other, but I don't think it particularly considers one character to be in the right. It's portraying the difficulty of navigating this divorce, and I think that it does very well. And I think anybody who's been through a breakup will probably be able to relate to at least aspects of that. Even if it's maybe everything, because there's the kid involved and everything's a little bit kind of like more set in its ways, it's maybe amplified, but I think there's a lot to relate to in that central relationship for sure.
And I think also this idea of like the expectation of the ideal the relationship breakup. I mean, I started to think about that movie Breakup with Jennifer Aniston and Ben and how not good that was, and for a while I was like, oh, that's pretty good, but how so true to these kinds of situations this really catches, where you might have these aspirational ideas on how you want things to happen, but emotions and energies take over, and life moving, locations and practicalities and stuff, and it does such a nice way of combining, like you said, a little bit of humor that comes out of that stuff, and also intensity.
Oh, also, I found I completely agree with Jim. I found myself at the beginning kind of going with Adam Driver. It's like, why would you move to LA and all this stuff? It's like, her reasons were unclear, but like it brilliantly like vacillates between the mindset. You're always either in Adam Driver's or Scarlett Johansson's head, particularly like the bits where they finally decide like that the lawyers are going to take care of this, and you're going, what the hell? And then whether it's like, her taking certain actions against him, or him taking actions as per like, finally settling on Ray Liotta as his lawyer, as his hotshot lawyer, that, he's upping his game. So I found that as well, is that you actually, by the midpoint of the film, you see that both people are so emotionally crippled, particularly the Driver character, and he's so in the wrong as well.
Yeah, but then ultimately he wasn't the one who did the breaking up, correct? Like, so there's this really interesting sort of thing to say, well, you would feel for the person in one situation who was broken up with, but then you can see what Scarlett Johansson's...
I think one thing that is done very well. On the Adam Driver side, not that I want to favour one over the other, but there was something about, and it's just, it feels like a particular aspect I only feel of actors of that sort of like generation Adam Driver seems uniquely placed to do, is that kind of like strange combination of arrogance and vulnerability. Like, I think he bound it, like, that is bound superbly in this film. Like, at times he comes across as just the most arrogant arsehole imaginable, but at the same time he still retains you still retain a little bit of sympathy and empathy, particularly towards the end of the film when, you know, things escalate basically. But like, the performances are really what make this film. I think they wouldn't have as much to work with without the script, which obviously comes from Baumbach, and, you know, the way that he approaches the shooting of the film. But really it is those central performances, and as we've discussed, the supporting ones that really make the film, I think.
Well, one of the things I was asked you guys about is, you know, where you see this, and I mean, I think you both have different opinions of Noah Baumbach, but then you look at this Adam Driver, and he's in about, I think, at least 3 films, if it could be more. I sort of see him in a very similar way that, like, when Woody Allen would play himself and sort of articulate, or he, near the later part of his career, would add some new characters in who would always play the Woody Allen character. That Adam Driver is particularly taking on that role in Noah Baumbach as he's growing into his own kind of, you know, relationship, social commentary filmmaker of New York.
As with much of the Woody Allen surrogates, I think Noah Baumbach's been quite kind to himself there as well. Like, his Adam Driver's quite a good-looking guy. He's about
really?
5 inches taller than him.
Yeah.
So
No, I'm sure it's totally that way, but you can definitely see that about him in general. As I mean, you know, but yeah, no, I definitely see that he kind of becomes that, you know, with, I think, When We Were Young, or what that film was, he sort of played that role of some sort too, and so I guess Ben Stiller did more for him. But anyway, yeah.
He does really, not just because of Kramer versus Kramer, he does remind me of Dustin Hoffman. Of like, so if you look at Adam Driver, he's playing this, and then in 2 weeks he's in Star Wars. Before that it was Dead Don't Die, and then The Report. Look at, like, Dustin Hoffman, he does Tootsie, but then before that he did, like, Kramer versus Kramer, and, you know, All the President's Men. So and all, like, Dustin Hoffman is very short, Adam Driver is very tall, yes, but they are, you know, chameleons, like, in that way, and being able to, like, vacillate between two, you know, the mainstream and the sort of more Oscar heavy.
You could say the same thing for Scarlett Johansson, though. I mean, you know, Avengers and whatnot.
Yeah, Adam Driver seems to be on a real run of it right now, though, because, I mean, of course, there was a report, which I don't think actually seems to have ended up as well regarded as they hope, but there's that, there's Marriage Story, there's the Star Wars films, and then also, because I didn't think this was going to get a release, but just to kind of, I suppose, finish this section on, Adam Driver will have another probably reasonably interesting release in January, because The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, Terry Gilliam's film, which was stuck in development and then distribution hell for a very long time, is actually getting a release in towards the end of January in the UK. So Adam Driver's on a real run of, like, actually really interesting and diverse roles. All
from the show, from starting as girls and Showgirls.
Yeah.
Unrequited Love. All right, well, that's on Marriage Story. If you didn't think we liked it, that would be shocking. We very much did, and so if you're a Netflix subscriber, maybe check it out.
Alright, so the next film we are reviewing is Jojo Rabbit, which is coming out on, I think it's January 3rd in the UK. It might have previews from New Year's Day, but it'll be out at the start of the month. It's had a festival run. It's directed by Taika Waititi, who is best known for, most recently, Thor Ragnarok, I would say, but he's also kind of well regarded for his irreverent comedy, What We Do in the Shadows, Hunt for the Wilder People. And this is an odd one to summarise, I'm not going to lie. It is set in Nazi Germany during the Second World War, and it follows a young boy, Jojo, who is a member of the Hitler Youth. And he also has an imaginary friend who takes the form of Adolf Hitler. And the imaginary Adolf Hitler is played by Taika Waititi. And we've actually got another Scarlett Johansson performance in this one. She plays Jojo's mother. And basically, the setup and the premise is Jojo is quite a little Nazi. He's very into his role in the Hitler Youth. But he finds that his mother is harbouring a young Jewish girl who's played by Thomasin McKenzie, who has done a lot of very interesting stuff. The thing that I think I saw her most recently in was Leave No Trace, Deborah Granick's really quite superb film from towards the end of 2018. So basically, they strike up a deal whereby, Jojo's going to get in trouble if he knows that she exists and is hiding in their walls, basically. And it's basically the journey of that central, the two children. And obviously there's stuff around the edges to do with Nazi Germany, the Gestapo, and various things, because it's very much pitched as a comedy, but it's going for a satirical angle, and that's basically the setup. Is basically Taika Waititi trying to take this very irreverent brand of humour that he has and applying it to a satire of Nazi Germany and that time period. So that's what it's trying to do. I have my thoughts, but Amanda, I'm interested to see what you made of it. You're the other person here who's seen it.
Oh, you don't want to give your overall thoughts on what you think?
No, I'll wait. I'll wait. I'll wait on the Hitler Youth film. Thank you.
I was going to say the past couple months. I was about to say when you suggested this film. Oh boy, here we go again. The Nightingale was very painful, and for me, comedies about Nazi Germany are some of my least I find very painful sort of to consider. I love World War II films, and I love watching them, but I also love critiquing and analyzing ones that I don't. And I think there's two comedies that people in this world think are the best, and I hate to. I mean, I love to say that I think are some of the worst I've ever seen. And one is Love Actually. Sorry to be the Grinch here, but I think it's terrible. And the second is Life is Beautiful. And I really sort of expected walking into this to feel the similar things that I felt about Life is Beautiful, where you're setting, and to some extent I do. I think I still feel a bit. I think I heard something like, "This is the most twee Nazi film ever made," or something like that. And in some aspects, the audacity to do a comedic film with children that's lighthearted in this setting is a complicated matter. So you have to perhaps give credit for being provocative and trying to create a story behind that. I also know I think Taika Waititi could not find someone to play the Adolf Hitler character, so he ended up having to do it himself. I was impressed that the fact that the characters, similar to the way people handle it, I think effectively in films like The Producers, the Nazi characters are such complete buffoons and portrayed in a way that allows you to sort of take on the subject matter and sort of understand that this is a story about a young man kind of coming and understanding his own identity in a very, very hard landscape and a very difficult time. And then as well with the performances of Scarlett Johansson, who is really the heroine of the story, really interesting character, and the understanding of how she navigates that world, not wanting to be a Nazi, but being, fighting for survival. I thought those were effective elements to the film, so I have to give it credit in that way. I know it was very, very popular. I think at the Toronto Film Festival it won. I think it's up for perhaps even an Oscar contender. I'm not sure it went 100% to me. I think there were times where the tone was well thought out and the script was interesting and the performances were good. But I think sometimes, it almost made it and some of the comedic moments. But there were times where I felt perhaps I didn't feel comfortable with them.
So I think in my case, I was never. This probably speaks more to my sense of humour than anything else. I don't think I certainly didn't feel uncomfortable with it at any point. I think there are bits that work better than others. Overall, I liked the film. I enjoyed it. I think I would recommend people go see it. I don't think anybody will be offended by it. well, I mean, I say that, I'm sure somebody will be, but I don't think it's as prone to offence as the premise's description might imply. The irony is, looking at trailers and the promos for it, it's actually kind of the most notable aspect, which is the bit that doesn't really work for me. I think what works is, as you say, this lampooning of the Nazi characters. And in that respect, it's not quite as effective as the work of Armando Iannucci, but that's actually kind of what it reminded me of.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned to me separately to that something about like the death of Stalin, and it kind of bearing some similarities to that. And to me, like, mine is maybe a slightly more confusing comparison, but it did remind me a little bit of In the Loop and kind of like some of the like bumbling politician characters there. Now, that's not to draw a parallel between the real life instances, of course, but it's the same idea of satirizing individuals in roles of power by making them out to be idiots, effectively. Yeah. And I think that's something which, for me, in the film actually worked really quite well. Sam Rockwell plays kind of like the local Nazi chief, I suppose. He's also like the head of the local office of Nazis, or something. I can't remember exactly what the role was. His role's quite an interesting one, and I think he plays that very well. Of all the supporting roles, Sam Rockwell's was the most interesting for me. And I think all that stuff works quite well. And it kind of chimes a little bit with what Taika Waititi's comedy is before. So in the same way that that approach to it reminded me of Armando Iannucci's work, some of the stuff that he picks up on and chooses to poke fun at reminded me of What We Do in the Shadows. Taika Waititi's comedy is the comedy of the mundane. Right, it's taking, and stuff that he's done before, he takes fantastical things and then makes it funny by making it as mundane as possible. If you take these fantastical characters or these fantastical ideas, what happens when you give them like just normal bollocks day-to-day stuff, right? And that's the entire premise of What We Do in the Shadows. It's vampires flat sharing. So in that respect, it's still very much within his wheelhouse. And there's one scene where, honestly, I really just found it hilarious. Stephen Merchant has a cameo as the sort of like the head of a local Gestapo unit, and he comes in, and it's this ridiculous thing where there's 8 of them, and they all say Heil Hitler to each other every time they go in and out of a room. It's absurd, it's ridiculous, and it really works extremely, extremely funny, because it's taking this horrific thing and it's then applying an absurdity to it. And those parts for me worked when Taika Waititi stays within what I believe to be his wheelhouse of the comedy of the mundane. The bit that doesn't work for me, or it works far less effectively, is actually ironically the headline instance of the imaginary Hitler friend, right, played by Taika Waititi. And I mean, don't get me wrong, there's the odd mild laugh out of it, but I don't really see what he was trying to achieve there. It seems to be, it's a particularly kind of whimsical, irreverent way of delivering exposition as to Jojo's mindset. Because when Jojo is wrestling with this idea of the Jewish girl who he is, beginning to have sympathy for, and it's kind of like breaking down a lot of like the propaganda he's been fed about Jewish people. The way that they vocalize that in the film is effectively him having conversations with the imaginary Hitler. Now, the imaginary Hitler is not particularly satirizing anything about Hitler. There's this one brief moment where he kind of goes into a very Hitler oratory style, but it's very fleeting. But other than that, I mean, basically, it's Taika Waititi with the German accent, and obviously that's probably a deliberate thing, because what's the point in making it similar to actual Hitler? But you take that one step further, what's the point in that character?
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think that my question is, and I think this goes back to my comment about Life is Beautiful. Can you make a mundane story or a story about like everyday, taking the fantastical and making it everyday and mundane in a topic and a setting in a place that is so rife with confusion and disparity and utter chaos and I'm not sure that's really possible. I think The Death of Stalin does a better job with dealing with that. I also there's these moments to me that the way that it's filmed, and perhaps that's his style, but it also felt a little bit like Wes Anderson's style for sure. And I think if you look at like the Grand Budapest Hotel, there's similar kind of ways in which handle this kind of similar topic. I didn't feel like it matched completely, and so that's the parts I didn't feel comfortable with. I also particularly didn't really like the end. I don't know, there was this moment, and I don't think I'm giving away too much, but there was some sort of like dance moment that felt like super hipster and felt like it should have been in some Noah Baumbach, Greta Gerwig film, from 2012, instead of in a film about the Nazis.
Yeah, I mean, I think and that's the only part where it doesn't. I think it worked better for me, but it's one of those elements where I think for me anyway, it gets away with it, but it's definitely not. It's definitely not in the pro column, because there are elements. Particularly, there's a segment early on in the film where it's like the Hitler Youth are taken out to train in the woods, and yes, at that point, especially the way certain bits are shot, it is a little bit like Moonrise Kingdom, but what if Nazi youth? It's
totally.
It doesn't quite work for me, but I think when it sticks to that comedy of the mundane, that's when it hits home. And I am going to disagree slightly in that I do think it can be done, because other things have done it, and in a way, I don't know whether this would have been a reference point for Taika Waititi, but something that would have been a useful reference point would be, I'm thinking of the 4th series of Blackadder here in the UK, right? And it's set in the First World War, it's set in the trenches, this horrible situation where, many, many people died, and, it was just a horrible set of circumstances, but somehow they created an extremely effective comedy out of that. And it's not comedy that just happens to be there, it actually makes comedy out of the scenario in which they find themselves. And I think a lot of the stuff that they deal with in this film, in terms of the types of propaganda that's getting put out, and the way that the low level bumbling Nazis go about their day to day, a lot of that is very funny, and I think it works very well. It's more just when it just tries to take that little step into the fantastical, and the most obvious example of that is imaginary Hitler, but there are a couple of other elements as well. That's when it loses a bit of effectiveness for me. And it tries to get a couple of emotional moments in, and I think it largely works. I think it largely gets away with it, but it is a slight tonal shift compared to Sam Rockwell bumbling around drunk in the local office, and them putting out ridiculous anti-Jewish propaganda like it's a information flyer. It does clash with that a little bit. For me, I think it gets away with it. I don't think it will with everyone. Your response to the film is probably going to depend on how much that takes you out of the comedy.
Yeah.
If you find that too jarring, then I can easily see how somebody would react to this kind of going, nah, this is not for me. For me, it worked, but I think that because it's not blended them maybe as well as it could have, that's where, if somebody is not going to go with the film, that seam, which is very obvious to me, that's where it will fall apart.
All right, and on that note, go see it if you like. Let us know what you think.
The music's very good. I'll say that. That's unambiguously, the music is good. But when you're saying that about this film, that probably says a lot. So, yeah. Okay. Out at the start of the month.
Yep.
So on our next topic, we're going to do what Jim has had several heart attacks about already, which is because it's the end of the year, but also the end of the decade. Cinetopia is doing a couple of things. We're doing a blog on our favorite films of the year, which you'll be able to read shortly. And but right now, we're gonna do our favorite films of the decade. This isn't a list. We'll talk about this in a moment, but these are recommendations.
If it turns into a list, I'm going to walk out.
we started thinking about we'll do each of us will pick 3 or 4 films and then just throw them out there, and then maybe because I know we all have our own opinions and not all of us have seen the films we've picked individually. So this is basically our recommendations, not just you, the adoring public, but also, for example, me to Jim and Amanda.
Yeah, I'd like to interject on that. Why, Jim, you hate lists? I just come to This Way Up. I just come back from This Way Up, and which is a film exhibition conference I highly recommend anyone considering going to if they're involved in film exhibition, running community cinemas or running a film festival, about the problem with lists. And it's because who owns those lists and who is controlling those lists, and then we have these kind of best lists of all time from different sort of perspectives, and we're missing out on so much cinema in a lot of ways by bringing it down to a cold thing where perhaps you would have never been able to have the opportunity to see a certain film. And it really, I think the idea of a recommendation for me is a good thing, because you might not have seen this film, so we're recommending them. But Jem, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, basically for me, it comes down to, now I can be a bit of a miserable git on this, right? As anybody who knows me, but in terms of giving scores to films, even when I'm reviewing films, I don't like giving them scores. I hate the idea of lists, and the reason for it is, whilst you can engage in a certain amount of objective analysis of a film, and I think if you're reviewing it, then really that's probably what you should do, your reaction in terms of whether you like it or not is ultimately completely subjective. I mean, we've seen this multiple times on even the films that we review on the show. So if I turn around and say, oh, these are the top 10 films of the decade, I mean, to who? I mean, me and no one else. I mean, it's not really of much use. And the reason I get so worked up about it is it kind of creates this idea of this is the popularly accepted canon of films you should see, right?
Exactly.
So and inevitably what ends up happening, whilst if you go and look at the IMDb top 20 or something, yeah, there's a whole bunch of really good films there. Yeah, you should probably watch them if you can. But ultimately what it comes down to is these are also good films that everybody also happens to have seen, and it's very rare for big lists like top 100 films of the decade to be done by one person, right? If they're done by one person, they have the problem I've said. If they're done by multiple people, then what's the criteria for this? And it just flares up pointless arguments about what is in it. Oh, this is too high. Oh, this should be below this. And it's trying to wrestle some sort of objective ranking out of something where you cannot do that. You just can't.
Yeah.
And that's why it annoys me so much.
So I think we're going to take it as recommendations, and then I also think the plan is maybe for a few interjections if we agree or disagree is the four. So I guess, Luka, why don't we start with you?
Right. So I will add to just quickly to what Jim said is that when you're trying to, for me, I decided to stick it to 3. I decided I was not going to put The Master on as a 4th film because that's a whole other discussion of worth 40 minutes about PTA that we could get into.
Well, is there a PTA? Well, I'm waiting to hear because you could just say the PTA.
Well, actually, yeah, the films are actually Inherent Vice, Phantom Thread, everything with
anything
The Master.
PTA.
Yeah.
You've got 2 Paul Thomas Anderson films when you only picked 3. You see, we're already arguing about it.
No, okay. The films I decided to pick, what I was going to say was I decided to go for 3. 3 is a perfect number, and for me, I decided to, also because we were talking about Jojo Rabbit, I decided to pick one very specifically kind of as a response, but also when you're doing 3, there is a curatorial element to it nevertheless, even if these are recommendations. So I decided to have a bit of a variety. So first up, the earliest one is from 2012, I believe, which is The Act of Killing.
Oh, boy.
Which I believe is a documentary game changer. A lot of people agree with me, but I think Amanda disagrees. Just quickly, I think it is... As a documentary, it is very much in line with it. Errol Morris and Herzog were there, and producing it, I guess, or at least involved with the distribution. It plays with documentary and the idea of how much of the truth is represented, and then also the moral quandary of a filmmaker visiting people that, if the Holocaust had happened and the guys who did it got away with it, and then he's getting them to recreate their crimes, almost as for their own glorification, but for us it's to show just the depth of the lack of morality that these people have, like, et cetera, about the human condition. And Amanda, what do you think?
Well, I'm not saying that it isn't a documentary changer in any aspect and very provocative in that sense. I do think that the fact that, and I highly I highly regard Errol Morris and Werner Herzog, but the idea that the form of the documentary takes precedence over the topic and giving a voice to the perpetrators. There's a moment in that film where one of the people who did much of the mass murders literally starts to heave and throw up, and that's how that film made me feel through the entire thing. I just wanted to throw up, and I realize that's an important aspect that that's
I
get
right?
that, but I still find real. There's a lot of issues for me with the hubris of a documentary filmmaker to make and change the story in that route and go forward with that, and also give voice to those people. I also think that if this was a story about Nazis, that it would never have been able to be made in the same way that it was.
If they had gotten away with it, that's my point, is that because that's the whole thing. It's like the documentary does, if I remember correctly, it does show that these people are held up as heroes on public television in Indonesia. So
yeah, no, I we could go on probably about it for a really long time. I think the thing I would say is that it definitely is not one of my favorite documentaries. I think the fact that we can have a dialogue about film and documentary and where it goes right and where it goes wrong from this film is good for film, but it certainly is an interesting choice.
Okay, the related to that sort of that's active killing, but the two that I really sort of have thought about and seen, actually. The second one I've seen about 5 times, and I've only seen the first one once. So the two films are Son of Saul and Blade Runner 2049. Let's go for a mainstream film, but I think Blade Runner 2049 is one of the highlight science fiction films in general. One of the best films that Hollywood has put out, in the last few years.
Just on the Blade Runner 2049 thing,
okay.
Right? Now, in short, I like the film, right? I'm not going to lambast you for picking it. I'm curious as to why you chose that over Arrival, for instance, which has a very similar mode of storytelling. It's Denis Villeneuve again,
yes.
And in that case, it's also, I say it's an original film. It's based on a short story. But obviously that doesn't come out of existing IP. What made you pick Blade Runner 2049 over something like that?
I think it's more expansive. I think the ideas are as broad as they are personal, whereas Arrival, I think there was something, even though obviously there was dealing with, multinational cooperation in times of crisis, it was a very personal story, and I love Arrival. But Blade Runner 2049 did something interesting, which was, and this has been talked a lot about, which is it tricked you into thinking that the protagonist was the hero. It was the hero's journey, and in many ways it was. There's sacrifice at the end of it. He does find his heroism, but it's an understated heroism in the sense that it's passed off to someone else. He finds that he's not the chosen one, and on top of that, I think the love scene in 2049 was that was a moment where I went, oh Christ, this is the future. It's like it made very accurate and poignant speculations that you couldn't look away from. Whereas Arrival, I love it, but and it did have its scope, but particularly because Blade Runner came out, I think, less than 12 months after Arrival, and it did feel like, okay, Denis Villeneuve, I need to make my sci-fi that's going to make me primer for Blade Runner.
I find it interesting. It's just because I love both films, but for me, Arrival is kind of the one that sticks with me a bit more. I think what I did like about Blade Runner 2049 was the fact that it was another example of how I think one of the best cinematographers.
Absolutely.
I mean, probably ever. But I mean, certainly like some of the in particular some of the stuff he's actually put out in the past decade. Roger Deakins. I mean, it really hammers that home. I find it interesting which one you would go for above those two, because I feel like one has stuck with me more as much as I like both. So it's just interesting to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, also I'm a fan of Philip K. Dick and the original, so I could go on about that one forever. If anyone wants to have a sci-fi podcast, holla. And then, okay, I will preface this by saying, didn't want to chime in. You already know my thoughts on Jojo Rabbit. Like, I haven't seen it, but went to see Knives Out last week, saw the trailer. I'm very skeptical, considering this is the decade where we've had Son of Saul, a film that Cloud Landsman, a director of The Great Showa, claimed that, I can't remember his exact quote, but he did suggest that this was the narrative film about the Holocaust that is definitive, that, for me anyway, resolved the issue of, how to portray this historical moment in a way that's actually really ahistorical, that focuses, as Laszlo Nemes, the director, said, it's like it focuses in a very Dardenne Brother way on the face of the human being that is going through Auschwitz. So for anyone who doesn't, you guys, have you seen it?
I haven't, no.
I haven't either, actually. It's one of these films that's been on my to-watch list for a while, but I've not got around to it. I've seen it once, and I remember every detail of it. It's one of those films that you watch. It is hard going, but it is an hour and 40 minutes. It's like you can do it, but you will be out of breath afterwards, because it's kind of... It's like what Woody Allen said about Throwing the Pity in Annie Hall. It's like, yeah, you're meant to feel guilty about it. But for me, that is the philosophical resolution of, what Hanukkah has said about, the idea of Schindler's List introducing suspense into the Holocaust when the Holocaust is a failure. And that's why I'm angry about Jojo Rabbit before I've even seen it, is because it does seem like having a story about the Holocaust in that way that's far more flippant, even as a satire, than it should be. And then to have Son of Saul really show us the tragedy of the Holocaust, I think that is.
Now, I wonder what Cloud Landsman thought of the act of killing. Because speaking of game-changing documentaries, Showa certainly is that for sure.
I think he would have liked Act of Killing, or I think he would have liked. If you're also interested, The Look of Silence, the sort of companion film that came out. I think it's a more quiet affair, literally, The Look of Silence.
For me, the best documentary of this decade goes... Well, there's two, actually, and two of my favorites are documentaries, go figure, is The Stories We Tell, which was written and directed by Sarah Polley, and I think it plays in a very similar way that it's a different story. It's a story about her personal life and her sort of reveal... It comes through interviews and through her own investigation of her family that she is the daughter of, or her mom had an extramarital affair, and she's the daughter of another person, another father, and ultimately the way that it deals with history and memory and archive footage and the family relationships and those over time. To me, that is far more of a game changer too than the act of killing, but also We Hate Lists, but it has been written up as one of the top 10 Canadian films of all time. But yeah, no, it's really, really, I just remember just crying so much in that film, and it really stands out to me as one of my most favorite documentaries I've seen in a really long time. And that was a while ago, because it was done in 2012. And 2012 must have been a really good year for me, because my other film that I would like to mention is Frances Ha, which Noah Baumbach, Greta Gerwig kind of duo, co-written by Greta Gerwig. I think it brings what Greta did bring some whimsy, if you will, to Noah Baumbach, who, like, I think a lot of people saw the squid whale and thought that he was the most depressing person on the planet. And the idea of divorce, obviously, he's become kind of, now that we talked about Marriage Story, the director known for the divorce story. But Frances Ha is, apart from its homage to Francois Truffaut, and I mean, when you said, I think Luka, you said that the cinematography was one of his best in Marriage Story. I think this is his best film in terms of cinematography.
Yeah, I'd agree. When we were talking about Marriage Story, and this is not to disagree with Luca, I think Marriage Story is a really great looking film, but Frances Ha is the one that sticks in my head because, like, one, I think it's kind of a delightful film anyway, but I was really taken with the look of it. To me, it was quite, for a film of its time. I mean, obviously, like, there are films that have done that sort of look before, but to me, that's his best looking film for me.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, it's all this homage to French New Wave, which I couldn't help but love. But also, again, the story of a different part of an artist's like career and New York. I mean, again, the setting of New York and trying to take a relationship, a different kind of relationship, a best friend, and navigate that through time, navigate that through, I mean, it really spoke to me at the time. It still really speaks to me. I shared most of my time in New York with a best friend, and we went different paths and came back together, and vice versa, and how important friendship is, apart from just relationship. So big sell for me on one of my favorites. And finally, I couldn't go without saying, which I've talked about much, and we've shown at different Cinetopias, but Agnes Varda's Faces Places. There's not another film out there that doesn't just touch my heart so much, and for that to be kind of not her final, but one of her last films in a career that was just so incredible, and the amount of humor and beauty and the story and the collaboration with JR, who is now one of my most favorite artists, just for his sense of humor and his like inherent kindness in the world. I couldn't say more wonderful things about it.
From the perspective of somebody who is less familiar with Agnes Varda, as you know, because we reviewed her last film on the show, and I wasn't wholly sold on it, but one of the things that I appreciate that film for, and also Faces Places when it came out, is like, I'm not going to lie, I wasn't as aware of Agnes Varda as perhaps I should have been, and off the back of that, I've gone back and I've revisited a lot of her filmography, and it's just some wonderful filmmaking, absolutely wonderful filmmaking. So regardless of what you think of Faces Places, which is good, but the very fact that she continued to make films which would then introduce her to new generations of cinema goers, I think is a wonderful thing, because the films that I've gone and watched off the back of being aware of that, I wouldn't replace them. They're wonderful filmmaking. I
cried as many times. I cried near the end, but particularly some of those B sequences. I cried as well, realizing that Godard is still a effing asshole.
I know. It really turned my whole life around. At least I can still love Truffaut for everything that he was, and mourn him not being the one who's around still to this day, especially with Frances Ha. I'd like to give my fourth to Under the Skin.
Love it.
And it's funny because that. When I saw it, I saw it at Nighthawk in Brooklyn, and it was really scary. But I also warn anyone who wants to go to Nighthawk that I found a roach like 5 minutes before, like on my table right before watching this, and then the lights went down, and I was like freaked out. And somehow I've ended up in Scotland, despite this film, perhaps because of this film. But it really didn't. It made Scotland kind of this really crazy, strange place.
Yeah, that film did seem to suggest that Glasgow was as scary as deepest space.
Maybe that's why I ended up in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
but no, really incredible film that just blew me away. I didn't even know what to expect. And also, of course, Scarlett Johansson shows her versatility there as well.
Yeah, I'm pleased you've picked Under the Skin, actually, because it's one of the one. So I think, as we've established, it gives me palpitations just thinking about needing to pick, like, a handful of films from the decade. But Under the Skin is one of the ones that I've not picked, but I came very close to picking. So I'm very glad you've said something about it, because at the time I watched it, I was blown away by it. I really think it's superb. The score from Michael Levy, we spoke about it briefly when we were reviewing Monos. Like, I think it captures, like, so many things, and for me, the thing that actually stays with me about Under the Skin is the score. Like, to me, in terms of kind of a new sound for film soundtracks, to me, Michael Levy is the person who comes to mind. Like, you've got your kind of established canon, your Hans Zimmers, your John Williamses, your all the rest of it, but the one which kind of like came into being in this decade, I would think. I can think of two, and one of my picks actually kind of covers it, but Michael Levy is the other one, so I'm very pleased you've picked that.
Yeah. And how about you, Jim?
Right, so here we go. Right, right. So the reason this gives me so much of a heart attack is more kind of like, I find it hard enough to pick films for, like, my favorite films of the year. What would I recommend people see from the past year? So you make it a decade, it's just like 10 more films to worry about forgetting about, right? However, I've gone with three. Right? I can throw in a fourth if we want, but the first one is actually probably a slightly controversial one. The part of the reason I've agonised over recommending this is it's super recency, right? If you want something to kind of sit for a while and determine whether you really think it's as good as you think it is, then you need a long time. And it's no coincidence that the other two films I'm going to mention are from 2011, right? So I'm going back a while. But the other one I'm picking, we've spoken about the show, so I'm not going to go on about it at length again, is The Irishman. Now, it maybe sounds a little bit early to be saying this, but really I was blown away by it. And it captures to me so much about the way film is going in this century. The fact that it is 3.5 hours long and it's on Netflix, and Scorsese basically couldn't get it made. Like, Paramount were meant to be doing it and they dropped out, and it's now got this life on Netflix, and it's opened up this debate about how it should be watched and everything. So in and of itself, I think it's a wonderful film. I really think it's fantastic, but I think also the context in which it's come about makes it an important one to see, just because it kind of gets you thinking about, not to open up this like Scorsese versus Marvel thing that's been kicking around, but what is cinema, right? Is it inherently tied to the environment in which you watch it, or is it an approach? Is it a formal thing? Can we define it? And if so, what are they, and who is the guardian of that? So I think the context in which The Irishman has been released also kind of captures a lot about cinema in this century.
What
this
is
decade.
your thought? Is cinema of how you watch it, or is it to me it's about telling a story with the moving image?
Yes, but the question is, like, how does it differ today? Because I've had arguments with people where they try to claim that effectively The Irishman is a television movie, which I think is absurd. So for me, I would agree. It's to do with the storytelling, and it's to do with the way you structure that story. And that for me is why this is not a small screen in the traditional sense of it. But this is where I think this is the best example of why we kind of need to have this discussion, because historically it's been very easy to define movies and cinema versus television and television movies, because it was literally, is it in a theatre or not, right? The very fact that Netflix, Amazon are producing their own films, and they're kind of balancing theatrical distribution with streaming, in some cases they're not, and then you've got companies in the UK like Curzon who are doing day and date releasing, so something is available right at the same time as it's in theatres. It's an interesting discussion to have, and I'm very firmly of the opinion that how cinematic something is and whether it is cinema is not tied to the medium in which you watch it. And the reason I say that is because there are many, many films that I think are wonderful that I've never seen on a big screen. And I don't think they're made any less cinematic by the fact that I've not seen it. If I could see them on a cinema screen, I absolutely would. But I don't feel like it's tied into what its primary release mechanism is. And I think this film, as well as being wonderful, in my opinion, is the kind of the hottest bed of debate where this has popped up.
Okay. And I know we've talked about it on the show as well, and why it's such a good film as well. So what's your others then?
So the other ones, the second one I'm going to go for is We Need to Talk About Kevin, directed by Lynn Ramsey. So Lynn Ramsey, to me, is one of the most effective and skilled directors working today.
Agreed.
Right? Now, you could make a case, and I'm sure many would, for if I was going to pick a Lynn Ramsey film, substituting out this for You Were Never Really Here, which was another absolutely superb film. To me, the reason I'm going for We Need to Talk About Kevin is it's just so bold. Now, You Were Never Really Here obviously is, but in the case of We Need to Talk About Kevin, I feel like it's blending more things together that make it interesting. Like her use of colour and the foreshadowing, I think, is incredible. When I first saw it in 2011, I maybe actually thought it was a little bit overwrought in that regard, but I reconsidered that opinion very quickly. I think Tilda Swinton is superb, and I think it captures probably what, for me anyway, is probably her best performance in this decade. And then there's various other things going on, and in the particular case of Lynn Ramsey, I find her a very interesting filmmaker because she's a female filmmaker, and this is the best example of her dealing with some aspects of this are very feminine themes, but they're not dealt with in a feminine way, right? It's not a gendered approach to film in the way that, you know, sometimes these things can be, and it blends that with kind of issues around American society and kind of, you know, are there in terms of weapons and things like that. It's a brilliant set of performances, and I don't think Ezra Miller has topped it since for me. I mean, he's been in quite a lot of good films.
The Flash, come on.
Yeah, well, let's just say Justice League is not making it into this list. But it deals with so many things, and it blends them together fantastically. I think it's also interesting as a literary adaptation, because, of course, it's based on a book, and the structure of the book is fundamentally different to what ends up in the film. And that's actually the case for You Were Never Really Here as well. So like, it really gets across her approach to film. It really features some of the best performances of the cast in there. I mean, it's wild to think that this has John C. Reilly in it. I mean, like, he plays the father in it, and it's a very straight role. But the performances she's got, the visuals of it, the adaptation, it does so many things brilliantly. That's basically why I've picked it.
I think I completely agree. I think that film and then You Were Never Really Here is interesting. Whilst Ratcatcher and Morven Keller are really interesting films, when you look at the production history of We Need to Talk About Kevin, like, she was meant to make Lovely Bones. Then, after Kevin, she was meant to make what she described as Moby Dick in space. And, like, I would agree that film, Kevin, really represents someone that's now making American movies, at least feature-length American movies, but hasn't lost any sense of her own artistic voice, and even has developed it, like, you know, into something even more poignant and hard-hitting over her career.
Yeah, and even things like the use of sound as well. I mean, like, I think in terms of the reaction to the film, You Were Never Really Here, I felt like I was having an anxiety attack for 2 straight hours. But the seeds of that, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of her use of sound, it starts in We Need to Talk About Kevin. You can very much see a consistency of tone across them. And for me, it's maybe a slightly more accessible story than You Were Never Really Here, and I think that's maybe why it gets in ahead of that. As I say, so many things come together. Like all those themes I spoke about, even the idea of nature versus nurture. To me, it really is one of the best films I've seen in recent years, and I think if somebody hasn't seen it, they should absolutely check it out, particularly if they've seen other Lynn Ramsey films that became. That goes for whether we're talking about her most recent, You Were Never Really Here, or even if you go back to her earlier films. And I think the one that I would jump upon would probably be Ratcatcher, right? And it's a different. It's different.
Her short films as well are really good, like Gasman and stuff.
But this is the thing. I honestly, I haven't seen every Lynn Ramsey film, and I haven't seen any of her shorts actually. But she is yet to make a film that I don't think is like good. Not even okay, good. And if you're looking for a way into Lynn Ramsey, I actually think, if you've not seen any Lynn Ramsey films, I actually think We Need to Talk About Kevin would be a good one to start with, because it's a very accessible modern film. It's less kind of like steeped to, like, like Ratcatcher, it's very based on kind of like an urban decay type thing. But We Need to Talk About Kevin, it has that kind of kernel of accessibility. It's a very easy story to get into, but then the way she approaches it and the themes that she deals with across that film, brilliant. The last one, right, and actually I don't think it is 2011, I think it's actually earlier, and I've gone for it for slightly different reasons. So I've wrestled with various things, right? So we've got the honourable mention for Under the Skin. I could have put Moonlight or Get Out in here, or other ones that I would have considered putting in. The one I've actually gone for is The Social Network. Now, the reason I've chosen The Social Network is, one, I'm a big fan of David Fincher's work, but also that is a film which is a curious one in that it's very easy to forget that was made only 5 years after Facebook had become a thing, right? And it would have entered production earlier than that, obviously, and it was based on a book which was written even earlier than that. And if anything, the way it has presented its real-life characters and the tone that it's gone for with it has aged beautifully. It's one of these rare things where it's depicting a particular set of real events in someone's life, and it's actually got better. It's not aged. It has got more prescient, and it has got more relevant than I think it even was when it came out. The other reason I've chosen it is also for more stylistic reasons. I think it was the first film I can remember where it had a soundtrack by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, and along with Michael Levy, who we spoke about for Under the Skin, her soundtracks are that. Another, the sort of like intensely modern sounding film soundtracks, I would choose the collaborations that those two have done. We've reviewed a few of them on the show, like Mid-90s was one where, the film itself is fine. It was never in any danger of making this list, but the soundtrack is superb, and it comes from those two. So there's various reasons for picking it from a story standpoint, performance standpoint, the fact that David Fincher is a fantastic filmmaker, but also the soundtrack to me really stands out.
I would even add on a stylistic. If I was to pick a Fincher of this decade, I'm conflicted between that or Gone Girl, which are his two most, as a great contemporary filmmaker dealing with contemporary issues, two really great films of their time. But I would say with Social Network as well, like add your stylistic bits of the film, that film made people working on laptops and computers really interesting, mainly because of the Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross soundtrack. And it showed that you don't have to have graphic effects where it's there's a pop-up with a message, just so you just have a really obsessed geek with a Nine Inch Nails soundtrack, typing, and it works.
The other thing that I think is worth pointing out for this film, and I'm going to include The Irishman in it as well, is I think if you take them together, part of the reason I've picked those two, it also kind of goes to show how far special effects have come in this decade. In particular, because The Irishman has all the de-aging techniques, and we've spoken about that in the review already, so I'm not going to go on about it because we've covered it. But the fact that you've even got Armie Hammer, you've got two of them in The Social Network, and I remember watching that in 2010 and just thinking they'd cast identical twins. And it really kind of goes to show how, because people complain about CGI and effects being poor, but in reality it's just you now notice the poor CGI. When you don't notice it, it's incredibly effective. And I think and David Fincher is one of these guys who has done that to fantastic effect. There's whole segments and backdrops and objects in his films that are effects generated and you don't realise. So actually The Social Network is quite a good example of that as well. I've primarily chosen it for soundtrack reasons and the prescience and continuing relevance of its story, but there's a lot going on in that film which, as I say, captures a lot of what has been good about film in this decade. And
I would even recommend check out his DVD commentaries, particularly on The Social Network. They're really good if you want to be a filmmaker or something. Yeah.
There you go. Right, so anyway, I've said my bit. Paul, what about you?
Blimey, past decade. Well, I just watched The Irishman actually, so yeah, that's a bit of a standout. It's the latest
Yes,
one.
I'm not the only one who's picking.
Yeah, no, it was very good. I mean, it's like a throwback to it's like Scorsese getting the gang together again for one last thrill on the way to the graveyard. But so I think The Irishman. There's a lot of really great. I've seen a lot of films. I've got a daughter, so I've been watching quite a lot of kids' films or younger person's films. Up, I think, is terrific, fantastic. I would say those two, yeah, in the last 9 years, yeah.
Up is an interesting choice. It's not something that would have popped up for me, but in terms of like animated films, I think that would definitely be up there for me in terms of if I was picking from that particular category.
It's quite heartrending, there's a little fat kid and the older guy, and they go off in a balloon. It's kind of has a bit of Wizard of Oz about it, which I really liked, and just the relationship between the two of them is quite heartrending and just a lovely, charming film, really. Well, that's a wrap for this month's edition of Cinetopia. We'll be back in January with the usual mix of interviews and reviews and chat. In the meantime, I hope you have a nice festive season and holidays. Thanks to everyone for listening, and thanks for the team. So it's Amanda Rogers, Luka Vukos, Jim Ross, and myself, Paul Bruce, and goodbye for now.
It's what it is.